The CEO was about to lose a multi-million-dollar contract with Russian investors because no one spoke the language. But then, the janitor's daughter walked into the room, and everything changed. On the morning of an ordinary Tuesday, the CEO of Valmore Industries, Alan Harper, was sitting in his office staring at his computer screen. The most important meeting of his career was being prepared. A multi-million-dollar deal with Russian investors, an opportunity that could change the direction of the company. At that moment, the financial reports were already prepared, the market projections were perfect, and everything seemed to be in place. The hard work of his team was finally about to pay off, but fate had other plans. The translator hired for the meeting still hadn't arrived. Alan had trusted that everything would go smoothly, but a silent alarm began to go off in his head when the clock struck the meeting's starting time and the translator was nowhere to be seen. Welcome, I'm Marcos Paulo, the storyteller. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and comment on which city you're watching from. The hall of Valmore's office was full of assistants and top-level executives, all preparing the final documents and fine-tuning the details to welcome the Russian investors. Tension began to accumulate. Time was crucial. Alan looked up from his screen and checked the clock, his heartbeat accelerating with each tick-tock. The translator was crucial to the success of the meeting, as the negotiations involved legal and financial terms that required precise interpretation. Without a translator, everything could fall apart. He couldn't let that happen. Suddenly, Alan's personal assistant entered with a panicked expression. "Mr. Harper, the translator has a problem. He's on his way, but won't be here in time. What should we do?" Alan felt the air escaping from his body. He knew the Russian investors wouldn't wait. They couldn't. With each passing second, the possibility of losing the deal grew. Alan didn't think about protocols or corporate image in that moment. He just thought about finding a quick solution, something he hadn't accounted for in any contingency plan. The clock ticked on, and the options were starting to fade. The pressure took hold of him. "We need to find someone who speaks Russian. Is there anyone else in the company?" Alan asked, looking around, hoping to find an immediate answer. But the response was negative. There was no one else in the building who could help. At that moment, the assistant looked at Alan with some doubt, as if evaluating whether he should say what was on his mind. "There's someone in the building, the janitor's daughter. She speaks Russian. She's not professional, but..." Alan couldn't believe what he was hearing. The janitor's daughter. Really? With no time to question it, Alan nodded, unable to find another solution. "Send her up now. We need her help." The assistant quickly left, and Alan remained there in his office, staring at the clock, feeling a mix of uncertainty and desperation. He didn't know who this girl was, but now his life and the future of his company depended on an unexpected decision. He couldn't let such a small inconvenience ruin an opportunity of this magnitude. He looked out of the window of his office, watching the Manhattan skyline, as if the whole world might collapse in that instant. Everything he had planned seemed to be falling apart, but the solution, though uncomfortable and out of place, was the only one he had. Now, all that was left was to wait. Elena took the elevator to the 57th floor of the Valmore Industries building with her father, the janitor. Her backpack was a little bigger than usual, but her face was calm, as if she were used to unusual situations. Despite her young age, Elena had always been a curious and mature child, although no one could have imagined that, in a moment of such pressure, she would become the pillar on which the future of a multi-million-dollar negotiation would rest. Upon arriving in the boardroom, the silence was palpable. The executives sitting at the table exchanged confused looks while Alan stared at Elena in disbelief. How could a 6-year-old girl be the answer to the translation crisis that had put the future of Valmore at risk? Elena walked into the room with a calm, almost unflappable attitude. The Russian executives, who were expecting the arrival of a professional translator, opened their eyes in surprise when they saw her. None of them could believe what they were seeing. Alan briefly considered stopping her, but time was running out, and there was no turning back. "Can you help us?" he asked, barely containing his astonishment. Elena looked him directly in the eyes, as if fully aware of the importance of the moment, and answered naturally, "Yes, I can help. I speak Russian." Elena calmly sat at the front of the table, next to Alan. At that moment, the Russian executives began to arrive. Sergei Volkov, the leader of the Russian delegation, observed the girl cautiously. Her attitude wasn't that of a typical child. There was something about her that he couldn't describe. He approached her and, with a stern look, asked in Russian, "Do you really speak Russian?" Elena, with the same calmness, replied in perfect Russian, "Yes, I do." Sergei raised his eyebrows, surprised by the fluency of the girl. He knew that what was about to happen wasn't normal, but the situation had already escalated too much to stop. So, without further ado, he instructed them to continue. Elena began translating the first words from the Russians. At first, the executives exchanged glances, but soon they realized the girl was speaking with surprising accuracy. Alan, still unable to believe what was happening, sat silently, watching Elena. Not only was she translating the words, but she was also picking up on the nuances and tone of the discussions. Every time a Russian executive made a subtle comment, Elena responded with the same skill. It was as if she were born to do this. The atmosphere in the room began to shift. The initial tension started to dissipate, and everyone in the room seemed more relaxed, as if they trusted the girl. As the meeting progressed, Elena continued translating, but there was something more that she was doing. She was setting the tone of the conversation. Without anyone saying so, she was guiding the negotiation with a calmness and determination that no one had expected. Alan, who had spent years learning how to manage the most complex negotiations, realized something important. The girl wasn't just interpreting words. She was handling the communication in a way that only great negotiators could. She was helping both sides understand each other and find common ground. With every passing minute, the tension in the room increased. Alan watched, more nervous by the second, as the Russians demanded more control over the company's operational decisions. The deal being negotiated wasn't just important for Valmore, it was important for the future of his career. The pressure of maintaining control while dealing with international investors was enormous. Sergei Volkov, the Russian leader, raised his voice, and his tone began to reflect impatience. As he spoke, his body language became more aggressive, and Alan knew that if he couldn't calm him down, the meeting would collapse. The translator, who was supposed to interpret these nuances, had never arrived, but Elena remained calm, translating with impressive clarity. Despite being a child, Elena wasn't just translating the words. She was picking up on the emotional nuances of the conversation. At one point, Sergei raised his voice in Russian and began making comments about the American decision-making system. The Valmore executives tensed up. Such comments would normally have escalated the situation. But Elena, with unwavering calmness, translated the words, and then, with subtlety, made a slight adjustment in her interpretation. She spoke in a way that softened Sergei's criticism, turning his comment into something more acceptable, less direct, less hurtful. When the girl spoke, no one expected what she said, and the effect was immediate. Sergei, surprised, looked at her more intently. Alan, who had been on the verge of collapse, felt relieved. The young interpreter had diffused a ticking time bomb with a single phrase. The other Russian executives began to relax as well, and some looked at Elena with curiosity. They no longer saw her as a child lost in a room full of adults. They saw her as an ally. Alan breathed deeply, but didn't dare speak. He couldn't. He knew that at this point, Elena had taken control of the situation. She had turned what could have been a confrontation into an opportunity for understanding. At that moment, he realized something he had never imagined. The girl didn't just speak Russian, she understood the language of business. She understood what was at stake. As the meeting continued, Elena translated Sergei's and his colleagues' interventions with astounding fluency. But beyond the words, there was something in her attitude that made a difference. Elena seemed to pick up on the emotions that accompanied every phrase. When a Russian investor made a more aggressive comment, the girl translated it, but with a touch of softness that made the tension in the room completely disappear. Alan, initially incredulous, now saw in Elena something more than a mere translator. She was handling the emotions of the meeting like an expert. She wasn't just translating the language, she was interpreting the psychology behind the words. Every time the Russians became harder, Elena found a way to soften the situation. Her ability to read the room was astonishing. As the meeting went on, the Russian executives began to respond positively to Elena's interventions. Their respect for her grew, and although many of Valmore's executives still couldn't believe what was happening, they realized they were witnessing something rare. A 6-year-old girl was handling an international multi-million-dollar negotiation with the same skill as any senior executive. Alan, who had relied his entire professional life on his instincts and skills, could only feel a mix of admiration and confusion. How had this girl gotten here? What would he have done without her? As the minutes passed, tensions kept rising. The Russian executives, led by Sergei, began demanding more control over the company's operational decisions. Despite Elena's skills as a translator, Alan knew the negotiation was about to reach a breaking point if they didn't reach an agreement. The last clause being discussed was about the shared control of strategic decisions at Valmore Industries, a delicate issue that could jeopardize the multi-million-dollar operation if not handled properly. The pressure was mounting for both the Russians and the Americans. The differences in how the company should be managed were about to explode. Sergei Volkov, with his firm and serious tone, began insisting that Valmore should give up more control. The conditions being negotiated no longer seemed favorable to the Russians, and Sergei's words were becoming more forceful. Alan, trying to maintain his composure, didn't know what to do. The feeling of losing the negotiation began to overwhelm him. He looked at Elena, who was sitting at the table, her eyes fixed on the documents she was translating. The girl was unflinching, and something about her calmness made Alan feel like there was still hope. But the situation was critical. Time was running out, and there was no margin for error. Without hesitation, Elena began speaking softly in Russian with Sergei, making a slight adjustment in her translation. At first, no one understood what she had said. But when Sergei responded in a calmer tone, Alan realized something had changed. Elena, with the subtlety of an experienced negotiator, had managed to soften Sergei's aggression. Despite being so young, she had touched the right nerves to prevent the discussion from turning into a confrontation. Sergei, who had initially seemed ready to abandon the negotiation, was now reconsidering his position. It was at that moment that Alan realized something fundamental. The girl wasn't just translating words. She was managing the negotiation with a wisdom beyond her years. Sergei, seeing the clarity with which Elena had communicated, nodded slowly, as if accepting that the proposed deal wasn't so bad after all. He leaned back in his chair with a softer expression than before. The other Russian executives in the room also began to relax, and the atmosphere became a little less tense. Alan looked at Elena, impressed. Not only had she calmed Sergei down, but she had gotten the Russians to reconsider their position without losing control of the situation. Every word Elena spoke seemed to carry strategic weight. Despite her young age, she seemed to understand the human elements of negotiation, something few adults could achieve with such skill. At that exact moment, Elena looked at Alan and made a small gesture with her hand. It wasn't a gesture of triumph, but rather an indication that the negotiation was moving toward a more positive direction. Alan felt a little more relieved. Despite the incredulity of everyone present, the girl had accomplished what many thought was impossible. She had transformed a potentially failed negotiation into an opportunity. A small adjustment in tone, a correct choice of words, and the atmosphere began to soften. Elena had done what many believed was impossible. The girl wasn't just interpreting, she was actively influencing how the parties understood each other. Alan couldn't stop admiring her. However, he knew there was still work to be done. The negotiation was still not concluded, and the Russians remained demanding. But the pressure he had felt just moments ago had eased, and much of that was thanks to Elena. She had made the first move to unlock the deal, but there was still one last barrier to overcome: the final terms of the agreement. As the meeting went on, the atmosphere in the boardroom grew denser. Although Elena's proposal had softened the initial tensions, there were still key points to resolve. The Russians wanted to ensure more control over operational decisions, something Alan wasn't willing to give up without clear guarantees. The room was full of nervous murmurs, and the pressure on Valmore's executives was palpable. But despite everything, Elena remained calm, sitting at the front of the table, translating with the same calmness she had shown from the beginning. At one point, when the Russians began to insist even more on their proposal, Alan felt that the situation might spiral out of control. The pressure was such that, for a moment, he thought about conceding to avoid the meeting falling apart. But before he could say anything, Elena raised her gaze, the same deep gaze she had shown since entering the room. With a calmness that surprised everyone, the girl gently interrupted the Russians. "I believe you can trust that the proposed model is not only beneficial for you, but also for Valmore," she said in Russian, looking at Sergei with a serene yet confident expression. Sergei looked at her for a moment, clearly surprised. No one expected a 6-year-old girl to speak about business with that depth. The way Elena addressed the situation, touching on the balance in the negotiation, seemed to resonate with the Russian executives. For a moment, everyone in the room fell silent, reflecting on the girl's words. Alan, watching the scene, began to understand something fundamental. Elena wasn't just translating words, she was actively participating in creating solutions. The Russians, who had been showing signs of disagreement, started to absorb the proposal with a more receptive attitude. Sergei, who had previously been one of the most skeptical, now seemed to be considering Elena's words more calmly. Alan felt relieved, but at the same time he was completely astounded. The girl had done what experienced negotiators hadn't been able to do in hours. She had opened a gap where both sides could yield without losing control. Alan watched Elena, a small girl but so powerful, and couldn't help but feel like he was watching a masterclass in diplomacy. Elena continued translating the proposals and comments precisely, but there was something in her attitude that set her apart. It wasn't just about translating words, it was about understanding the essence of communication. She understood that in negotiation, emotions and intentions were as important as numbers and legal terms. While everyone in the room struggled to hold their ground, Elena seemed to be the only one who could keep calm and find common ground. In a way, her presence was balancing the weight of the conversation, something even the most experienced couldn't do. As the meeting went on, Alan began to realize that Elena was making a much bigger difference than he had anticipated. She wasn't just solving a translation crisis, she was helping to unlock the deal. What had started as a situation that threatened to destroy everything was slowly turning into an opportunity for everyone. Alan, though still skeptical about the situation, couldn't deny that Elena was becoming the key player in closing the negotiation. Something as unexpected as a 6-year-old girl had turned the meeting around definitively. The tension in the boardroom had decreased, but the negotiation was still far from being completed. Despite Elena's proposals, the Russians were still firm on some demands, especially regarding operational control. Alan, though relieved by the calm Elena had brought, couldn't let his guard down. The final terms of the negotiation had to be carefully evaluated, and there was still a lot to do. However, something had changed in the dynamic of the meeting. The trust the Russians showed toward Elena was palpable, and this began to reflect in the tone of the conversation. Sergei Volkov, who had previously been one of the most inflexible, began to give in slowly. "We understand your proposal, but we need more control over certain decisions," he said, with a softer tone than before. Eleanor, as always, listened carefully, capturing not only the words, but the emotions that accompanied them. "We can make adjustments, but ensure that all decisions are consensual," she translated firmly, but without losing cordiality. Sergei looked at her intently, as if evaluating whether he could trust such a young girl to mediate a deal of this magnitude. The atmosphere grew more relaxed, and for the first time since the meeting started, the two sides seemed to be finding common ground. Alan, however, knew this wasn't the end. The Russians still had tough demands, and the room for negotiation was narrow. While Valmore's executives discussed among themselves, Elena sat silently, observing, as if waiting for the right moment to intervene again. Alan, who had lost count of how many times he'd checked the clock, couldn't help but admire the girl's composure. It was as though she were controlling the flow of the meeting, guiding the conversations effortlessly. At that moment, Elena raised her hand gently, asking to speak. Alan looked at her in surprise, as he thought she was waiting for the executives to take the reins of the negotiation. But Elena, with a calmness only great negotiators possess, said, "We can reach an agreement, but it's important that both sides have the same confidence in the process. We must ensure that not only the agreements are respected, but also the people involved in the process." Alan, impressed, nodded slowly. This wasn't just a child speaking Russian. This was someone who understood the human dynamics of high-level negotiations. Elena wasn't just translating words, she was interpreting the intentions behind each phrase. And at that moment, Alan understood something he had never considered. The ability to negotiate wasn't just about words, but about the ability to manage emotions, expectations, and silences. Elena had mastered this art with a grace that no one in the room had anticipated. Sergei and the other Russian executives, who had been skeptical at first, were now looking at Elena with respect. She was no longer just a little girl in a room full of adults. She was a key player at the negotiation table. As the Russians absorbed Elena's words, Alan allowed himself to breathe. For the first time in hours, the conversation was moving in a positive direction, but he knew there was still work to be done. The final terms of the negotiation had to be agreed upon, and the pressure remained high. However, the calm Elena had brought, with her emotional intelligence and her ability to read people, had completely changed the dynamic of the room. Alan looked at Elena with admiration, grateful for her intervention, but he also knew that in the end, he would have to make the final decision on how to close the deal. Still, it was clear that the girl had played a fundamental role in what seemed like an impossible negotiation. The negotiation reached a critical point. The operational terms remained the main obstacle. The Russians wanted more control, something Alan couldn't accept without compromising the company's autonomy. As Valmore's executives discussed among themselves, the glances toward Elena became more frequent. She was no longer just a child. She was the key piece that was bringing both sides together. Elena, with her calm concentration, continued paying attention to every word spoken, but she was also capturing the emotions that accompanied them. She wasn't just translating. She was helping guide the intentions of each party. Sergei Volkov, the leader of the Russian investors, began expressing his frustrations in Russian. It was clear that the situation was getting tenser. Alan thought about conceding, coming to an agreement that the Russians would accept, but he knew that this could have negative consequences for Valmore's future. Then, suddenly, Elena spoke. It wasn't just a translation of what Sergei had said, but a strategic intervention. What Sergei is suggesting isn't just a concession, it's an opportunity to strengthen the relationship between both parties, Elena said, surprising everyone in the room. For a moment, the room fell silent. Alan looked at her, stunned by the clarity and maturity of her words. Elena was suggesting that instead of fighting over every little clause, both sides could gain something by yielding on the key points. If both sides win something, the negotiation won't only be successful, but can also be maintained in the future, she added. It was as if Elena had found a way to interpret what both sides really needed, not just a control agreement, but a partnership based on mutual trust. At that moment, Alan realized something crucial. Elena wasn't just solving translation problems, she was solving the underlying conflict, the one that really mattered. How both sides could reach a true understanding. Sergei, initially taken aback, began to reflect on what Elena had said. No one had addressed the issue so directly before. The girl hadn't just proposed a practical solution. She had shown a deep understanding of human and business dynamics that many executives hadn't been able to grasp. As Sergei thought about Elena's words, the other Russian executives began to absorb the proposal. Alan watched in silence, with a mix of astonishment and relief. Unknowingly, Elena had made the turn that the negotiation needed. The Russians were willing to yield, but not only because the words had been translated, but because Elena had shown them a path to a genuine agreement. With Elena's intervention, the atmosphere in the boardroom changed. The tension that had been building throughout the meeting began to dissipate. Sergei looked at his Russian colleagues, nodding his head. "I agree," he said finally, with a smile that seemed sincere. "We'll do it your way, but with the necessary guarantees. Valmore will be part of a joint operation, but will also have control over key decisions." Alan, for a moment, didn't know how to react. He was about to receive the agreement he had dreamed of, but with a condition no one had anticipated. Elena, the girl, had been the bridge that made this possible. As he thought about what had just happened, Elena looked at him with a small smile, unaware of the magnitude of her intervention. As the final agreements began to take shape, the atmosphere in the boardroom became more relaxed, but the tension was still present. The Russians, led by Sergei, started being more willing to yield on several key points, and Valmore's team, despite the initial incredulity, no longer saw Elena as a child, but as a crucial piece in the process. The trust that the girl had built in just a few hours was surprising. Alan, sitting at the end of the table, watched in awe as Elena mediated between both sides, with a skill no one had expected. It was impressive how her presence had completely changed the tone of the meeting. What had started as a crisis threatening to destroy everything now seemed to be heading toward an agreement. Elena, as if unaware of the impact she had, continued translating the Russians' words with flawless precision. But beyond that, her interventions were strategic, always aiming at creating a balanced solution. In each executive's intervention, the girl adjusted the words so that both sides felt their interests were being respected. "If both sides yield on the key points, everything will be balanced," she said once again, with a firm but soft voice. "It's not about winning, it's about moving forward together," she added, looking both at the Russians and Valmore's executives. And so, while others discussed minor terms, Elena, unknowingly, was taking control of the conversation. Sergei's eyes, which had previously been focused on the contracts, now followed every word Elena said. He realized that, in fact, it wasn't just about what was being said, but how it was said. The girl had achieved something that many adults in the room hadn't understood: the importance of building a communication bridge between emotions and interests. When Sergei finally nodded at one of Elena's proposals, he extended his hand to her as a sign of respect. "I think we have something here, Elena," he said, with a smile that wasn't typical for him. The other Russians also began nodding, acknowledging the girl's ability to guide the negotiation to a place where everyone could feel comfortable. The respect for Elena, which at first had been just a gesture of curiosity, had transformed into genuine admiration. Valmore's executives, some of whom had initially seen her as just a child, now looked at her with a new perspective. Alan, however, sat in silence, unsure how to express the gratitude he felt. The meeting had started as an imminent disaster, but now, with a simple gesture of trust in Elena, everything had changed. The girl had done what seemed impossible, a negotiation that, despite the challenges, would end with a favorable agreement for both sides. When the meeting ended, executives from both sides stood to shake hands, but something was different. The focus wasn't just on the contracts to be signed, but on the impact Elena had had on the entire process. Alan got up from his chair, walked over to her, and in a gesture that surprised everyone, extended his hand. "Thank you, Elena. You've done much more than we expected," he said with a sincere smile. The girl, looking at Alan, simply nodded and smiled back. She wasn't aware of the magnitude of what she had achieved, but at that moment, something inside her understood that, despite her age, she had done something big. After the meeting, everything seemed to return to normal, at least on the surface. The contracts were signed, the agreements were sealed, and the Russian executives left satisfied. However, something had changed, not only in the course of the negotiation, but in the way everyone in the room viewed things. Alan, leaving the boardroom, walked with longer, firmer steps, but he was also deep in thought. He couldn't stop thinking about Elena. Throughout his career, Alan had met top-level executives, lawyers with years of experience, and world-class negotiators, but none of them had achieved what that 6-year-old girl had in just a few hours. A 6-year-old had managed the negotiation as skillfully as a professional, and for the first time, he found himself questioning everything he had learned about business. Eleanor, on her part, returned home with her father, as calm as always. In her mind, nothing that had happened that morning seemed strange to her. It had felt completely natural. From a young age, she had lived between two worlds. Her mother, who was Russian, had taught her to speak Russian fluently, while her father, a humble man who worked as a janitor in the building, had taught her to be observant, to catch the invisible details of everyday life. Somehow, Elena had learned to see the world through others' eyes, and that gave her a unique advantage when it came to understanding people's emotions and motivations. She didn't understand the impact of her words nor the weight of her intervention, but something inside her knew she had done something big. The next day, emails started arriving at Alan's office with numerous congratulations for the success of the negotiation, but what really caught his attention was a message that arrived in the morning. It was from one of the Russian investors, a man named Ivan Petrov. "The little girl who translated for us, Elena. How do we find her? We need her to work with us. She has a unique talent." Alan, upon reading the message, felt a mix of surprise and pride. Not only the Russians, but also other executives within Valmore started asking questions about Elena. Some wanted her to join the international relations team, while others simply wanted to know how she had managed to handle the boardroom with such maturity. The question was the same. Who was that girl who had saved such a monumental negotiation? Of course, the Valmore executives, though impressed, remained reserved. Some considered that everything that had happened was a fluke, a stroke of luck, but no one could deny that the final result had been positive. Alan, however, no longer saw things the same way. The girl, with her innate wisdom, had done what many of the greatest experts couldn't do in an entire lifetime. The negotiation had been a success, yes, but so had the way Elena made everyone involved feel understood and respected. That was a rare skill, one not taught in any business school. That evening, while having dinner with his wife, Alan couldn't stop thinking about Elena. What should he do? He knew that the girl had shown exceptional talent, but was it right to involve her more in the business world? He still didn't fully understand the magnitude of what had happened in the boardroom, but something inside him told him that he couldn't let the opportunity pass. Elena hadn't just saved the negotiation. She had done something even more important. She had opened a door to a new way of doing business. Alan understood that if he let Elena slip by as an opportunity, he would lose something invaluable, something that could change not only the company, but also his own approach to work. The next day, Alan approached his assistant. "I need your help with something. I need to contact Elena's family." I want to talk to them about something." The assistant, surprised, nodded. Alan knew it wasn't just a formality. He was making a decision that, in many ways, would change the course of his career. And at the same time, it would change the life of a girl who had never imagined she could have such an impact in the adult world. Elena, for her part, continued with her everyday life, unaware of the magnitude of the change she had created. As her father took her back home, she didn't understand what had happened in the boardroom, but she did feel that something had changed. No one had yet explained the importance of her intervention, but somehow the girl knew that in some way she had done something big, something that gave her a purpose that, until that moment, she didn't understand. The next day was the crucial moment. Alan, after thinking about it for days, decided to make a decision that would surprise even him. He called Elena's parents and requested a meeting. When Elena's father answered the phone, Alan introduced himself and said, "I'd like to talk to you about your daughter's future. I believe she has a unique talent, and I want to discuss how we can support her to keep growing in the business world." Although Elena's father was surprised by the call, he accepted the invitation without hesitation. Alan knew that what he was about to do would not only affect the future of Valmore, but also that of Elena. It was a risk, but the risk of letting someone with that talent go was far greater. When Alan met with Elena's family, he expressed his admiration for the girl's talent, but he also made it clear to her parents that this was not something that could go unnoticed. He offered Elena a position in the international relations team at Valmore, starting with a mentorship program and small projects where she could learn just like any adult in the industry. "I want Elena to have the opportunity to develop her full potential. I'm willing to support her to grow in this complex world," Alan said, looking at Elena's parents with sincerity. He knew that what he was offering was an uncertain future, but also a future full of possibilities for someone as special as her. Elena's father, although surprised by the proposal, saw something in Alan's eyes that he had never seen before, the same determination that had led Valmore Industries to success. He knew his daughter wasn't an ordinary child. His wife, who had passed away when Elena was very young, had always taught her that intelligence didn't depend on age or context, but on the ability to connect with people. Elena had already demonstrated that ability. Elena's father accepted Alan's offer with humility and gratitude. "If my daughter has the opportunity to do something great, you can count on our support," he said with a shy smile. Elena didn't fully understand what had happened, but something inside her felt that her life was changing. Alan's invitation to join the Valmore team had been a surprise, but also a unique opportunity. For days, she couldn't stop thinking about what it meant. Was she really ready to enter the adult world? Could she handle everything that was expected of her? For the first time, Elena began to doubt her own abilities. Although she trusted what she had done in the boardroom, she knew that the situation was different now. She was no longer just a child in an adult space. Now, she was expected to be part of the team. At first, the early days at the company were challenging for Elena. She not only had to adapt to the corporate environment, but also prove that her presence there wasn't a fluke. Although Alan offered her support, her integration into the team wasn't as easy as she had thought. Valmore's executives, who had initially seen her as a curiosity, now faced the reality of working alongside a 6-year-old with a talent many of them didn't fully understand. Some, though respectful, began questioning whether it was appropriate for a child to be involved in such important projects. "She's a brilliant mind, but is this really the right time to involve her in such complex decisions?" they would whisper among themselves in quiet hallways. At first, Elena felt the weight of these unanswered questions. She knew her age was an obstacle. Even though she had proven her worth in the negotiation, she felt that her colleagues didn't take her seriously. Her interventions in meetings were often followed by doubtful glances, and she frequently had to defend her ideas with more vigor than she would have liked. Sometimes she wondered if what she had achieved in the boardroom had been just a stroke of luck. In her mind, doubt began to creep in. Can I really belong here? She thought, as she observed the adults around her, so sure of themselves, so experienced. However, Elena didn't give up. She remembered what her mother had always told her. Don't let your age limit you, my dear. Wisdom doesn't have age. It just has an open mind and a desire to learn. With that phrase in her heart, Eleanor got up every morning, determined to show she had a place at Valmore. As the days passed, small changes began to happen. The other executives started to recognize her ability to think differently. Her skill in not just translating words but emotions made her stand out in a way no one had anticipated. They began involving her more in meetings, and Elena began to see how her ideas were being taken into account. But not everything was easy. Sometimes the adults in the room looked at her as if she were an experiment or novelty. The real test came when Elena proposed an internal mentorship model, something that could help younger employees develop and become part of key decisions. Although the proposal was met with skepticism, it was Alan who immediately supported it. It's a solid proposal, based on what the team really needs. We should listen to Elena, he said, surprising everyone in the room. It was a turning point, one where Elena's influence began to make a difference. Elena felt a mix of pride and fear. For the first time, her idea was accepted, but with that acceptance came the responsibility that something significant now depended on her. She didn't know if she was ready, but she understood that this was her chance to prove her real value. I'm just following my instinct, she thought, as she prepared for the next meeting, knowing that every word, every intervention could be the start of something big. Now she wasn't just doing what she was told. She was making decisions and showing that, although small, she had the ability to change the rules of the game. The days passed quickly for Eleanor at Valmore Industries. While her presence no longer surprised people as much as it had at the beginning, her place in the company remained an enigma to many. Although she had earned the respect of the executives, some still doubted her ability to thrive in this world. She's just a kid, they would sometimes whisper. Does she really have what it takes to belong here? Elena, however, was no longer the same. Her sharp mind had begun to challenge expectations. She was no longer the little girl who simply translated and offered solutions in a boardroom. Now she was making key decisions and proposing projects, and she did so with a naturalness that amazed everyone. Her biggest challenge came when she was invited to lead an important meeting about Valmore's expansion into Eastern Europe. The senior executives, although initially skeptical, accepted her leadership because they trusted the ideas she had proposed. However, when the day of the meeting arrived, Elena felt more nervous than ever. She knew that this time it wasn't enough to just offer ideas. She had to lead a team of adults with more experience than her. Everyone in the room, although professional, looked at her with curiosity. It was as if they were waiting for her to make a mistake. That pressure, though small in her mind, was a heavy burden to ignore. Even at just 6 years old, Elena was beginning to experience the magnitude of responsibility. As the meeting began, her voice, though firm, trembled slightly. But as she started explaining her proposal, something changed within her. She knew the ideas she was sharing were valid. She had spent days researching and understanding the market, and what she was about to say made sense. As she shared her viewpoints, Elena began to see the reaction of the executives. At first, her proposal was met with doubts, but soon they started to recognize the logic of her plan. The European project team, who had initially been unsure about listening to a child, began to ask questions. And they weren't questions about her age. They were about her ideas. The pressure was increasing, but Elena no longer felt fear. With each word she spoke, with every answer she gave, her confidence grew. The meeting lasted for hours, but in the end, the executives accepted her proposal. The expansion plan was approved, and everyone in the room looked at her with respect. Alan, who had been present during the entire meeting, couldn't help but smile. He knew Elena had changed the course of the meeting, not just with her intelligence, but with her ability to remain firm, regardless of age or the skepticism of others. Although the success of the meeting was a huge achievement for Elena, what impacted her most was how she herself had changed. She no longer saw herself as a child who simply interpreted the words of others. Now, she saw herself as a leader. A small leader, perhaps, but one who had demonstrated that great changes don't depend on the size of the person, but on their vision, their willingness to learn, and above all, their ability to lead with the heart. Elena had earned her place in the adult world. However, as she left the boardroom, she realized something fundamental. There was still so much for her to learn. As the weeks went by, Elena began to adapt to the fast-paced world of business. Although her age still piqued curiosity for many, her presence no longer caused surprise, but rather growing admiration. The executives at Valmore Industries began to see her differently. She was no longer just the child who had intervened in a crucial negotiation. Now, she was a young woman with fresh ideas and innovative strategies. Her ability to understand the nuances of human relationships, something she had demonstrated from the beginning, allowed her to offer solutions that no one else had considered. Elena started working on more complex projects, leading small teams in areas where her communication skills were essential. She was assigned the challenge of managing the company's expansion into a new market, one that had historically been difficult to approach. Initial reports suggested that the obstacles would be significant: cultural barriers, lack of knowledge about local regulations, and of course the risk of failure. However, Elena didn't hesitate for a second. She knew the road wouldn't be easy, but her confidence in herself and her team grew more and more. As she moved forward with her work, Elena also had to face growing pressure. Not only executives, but also clients and collaborators began to place high expectations on her shoulders. The meetings, which had once been just a space to express ideas, were now evaluations of her decision-making capacity. Sometimes she felt overwhelmed. Although she never said it, doubts began to creep in. Can I handle all of this? Am I making the right decisions? But as the days passed, she began to realize something important. Doubts were natural, but they shouldn't stop her. After all, she had overcome much bigger obstacles by being seen as a child in a world of adults. There was no turning back now. One day, while reviewing proposals for the expansion, Elena had a revelation. Throughout all this time, she had been focused on gaining the respect of others, proving that her ideas mattered. But what really mattered, what made her special, was her ability to look beyond numbers and strategies. She knew how to listen, how to catch what people really wanted and needed. That was the key to her success. The ability to create genuine connections, not just at a professional level, but on a personal one. That evening, when she got home, Elena thanked her father for everything he had taught her. Everything I'm doing, everything I've learned, is because you always taught me to listen, not just to words, but to silences, to emotions. That's what helps me understand the world. Her father, with a proud smile, gently patted her head. Never forget that, daughter. True power lies in understanding what others don't say. That night, Elena realized that her path wasn't just about intelligence or translation skills, but her ability to be an empathetic leader, capable of connecting people and guiding them toward a common goal. As Elena continued her rise at Valmore Industries, the pressure steadily increased. The expectations placed on her no longer came solely from the company executives, but also from international clients, strategic partners, and even her own team. At first, Elena enjoyed her ability to influence decisions, but soon she began to realize that every action she took had a much bigger weight than she had imagined. With the growth of her influence within the company came challenges that, though inevitable, were not easy to bear. One of the most difficult moments came when Valmore had to face a disagreement with one of its key business partners in Europe. Negotiations had stalled due to a mistake in the interpretation of a contract, and the terms that had initially been accepted by both parties were no longer valid. Elena, who had been involved in the review of that contract, had to face the reality that her initial decision had been crucial to the stalemate in the talks. Though she was just a part of the team that had worked on the deal, the pressure of being the visible face of the company weighed heavily on her shoulders. She sat in front of her desk that night, staring at the documents, questioning whether she had made the right decision. Could I have foreseen this? Should I have been more cautious? She thought as she went over the terms of the agreement again and again. The feeling of guilt settled in her mind. She knew she had to act fast, but she also feared that by making the wrong decision, she could lose everything she had worked for so far. For days, she struggled with the idea of approaching Alan to discuss the problem, fearing that her reputation, which she had worked so hard to build, could come crashing down due to a mistake she had made. One afternoon, while walking through the building's hallways, she found Alan in the cafeteria. He looked at her with a calm expression, as if he knew exactly what was going through her mind. "How's everything going?" he asked, with a smile. Elena, still unable to find the words, sat down in front of him. "There's a problem with the European contract. I think I made a mistake. The agreement I proposed is no longer valid," she said. Alan looked at her intently, without showing any concern. "Elena, everyone makes mistakes, but what matters is how we fix them. What you've done so far has been incredible. This is just one of those tests we all have to face, except in your case, the mistake is more visible. But don't worry, we have time to solve it." Those simple and direct words gave Elena a new perspective. Alan wasn't reprimanding her. He understood that mistakes were part of the learning process. The pressure she felt was nothing more than the reflection of the high expectations that had been placed on her. And while those expectations were necessary, she also needed to understand that not everything in business is perfect. From that moment on, Elena understood that the responsibility of being a leader didn't mean being infallible, but knowing how to get back up after a fall. In the following days, Elena worked with her team to fix the mistake. Together, they found a viable solution and managed to renegotiate the contract with the European partners, this time with more favorable terms for both sides. The negotiation was successfully resolved, and when the revised agreements were finally signed, Elena realized something very important. The obstacles she had faced hadn't weakened her, they had made her stronger. She had learned to make decisions under pressure and to face challenges with determination. Elena stood by the window of her office, looking out at the New York City skyline. The soft breeze coming through the window brushed her face as she thought about everything she had accomplished in such a short time. It had been a difficult path, full of unexpected challenges, but also great satisfactions. What had started as an accidental incident, a mistake in hiring a translator, had completely transformed her life. Now at just 6 years old, Elena was not only a part of Valmore Industries, but she had also proven that her unique vision was as valuable as that of any seasoned adult. In the past few months, Elena had worked alongside Alan and other company executives on several key projects. Her ability to understand human emotions and translate them into strategic decisions had transformed the way Valmore operated. Projects that once seemed like simple administrative tasks were now approached with a more human focus, thanks to her intervention. She had taught adults that the key to a successful business was not just the numbers, but the ability to connect with people, to understand their motivations, and to build trust. Elena had not only been a translator, she had been a mediator, a bridge between different worlds. However, her journey was far from over. Elena knew that, although her impact on the company had been significant, there was still so much to learn. Despite her achievements, her heart was still searching for something more. It wasn't just about running a company, it was about creating real change, something that transcended the walls of Valmore and touched people's lives. She wanted to use her skills to help others, to teach them that, regardless of their age, they could have a voice in places where important decisions are made. As the year drew to a close, Alan called her in for a special meeting. "Elena, you've done more for this company than many adults could have done in a lifetime, and I know this is just the beginning for you. You're not just a leader here. You have the power to make everyone around you better. I've decided that you'll be part of the management team, but I also want you to lead a new project that involves younger people in the industry. I want you to help create a mentorship program that gives young people like you the opportunity to get involved in the corporate world early on." Alan's words were a recognition not just of her talent, but of her ability to influence the business world in a profound way. Elena, with her serene gaze, accepted the proposal without hesitation. She knew that this new challenge would be the next step in her journey. As she left the meeting, Elena looked out the office window, watching the city continue its course, unaware of the changes that were taking place within her. For a moment, she allowed herself to reflect on her own journey. She had started as a child who simply translated words, but now she was becoming a leader who translated dreams into reality. The little girl, who had been invisible to many, was now shaping the future of one of the world's largest companies. And more importantly, Elena knew that her true legacy wouldn't just be in the signed contracts or successful agreements. Her legacy would be in how she had changed the way people understood each other, in how she had shown that true wisdom has no age. With a smile, Elena stood up and left her office. She knew that the world still had much to offer her, and she was ready to accept it. As time passed, Elena's role at Valmore Industries continued to evolve. The more she worked, the more she earned the respect of everyone around her. Despite being just a child, her influence was undeniable. She had become an integral part of the company, a reminder that sometimes true leadership comes in unexpected forms. The mentorship program she spearheaded was a huge success, not only because it gave younger employees the opportunity to grow, but also because it reflected Elena's unique approach to leadership. She didn't just want to see people succeed, she wanted them to feel heard, understood, and valued. The program became a model for inclusivity within the company, a testament to the importance of empathy in business. Elena's ability to bridge the gap between the human side of negotiations and the corporate side had made her indispensable. She helped steer conversations, calmed tensions, and guided her colleagues to solutions that were not only profitable, but also considerate of people's feelings and perspectives. Her quiet, yet firm leadership style was slowly transforming Valmore Industries into a more humane and thoughtful organization. But as expected, not everyone was pleased with the changes. Some of the executives, particularly the more traditional ones, found it difficult to accept a child in a position of power. There were murmurs behind closed doors, skepticism, and even concern about how Elena's approach might affect the long-term success of the company. Despite the challenges, Elena remained unbothered. She had never let other people's doubts stop her from doing what she believed was right. She had learned to trust her instincts, to rely on the wisdom her mother had passed down to her, and to continue leading with her heart. She understood that true leadership was not about age, titles, or experience. It was about integrity, connection, and courage. One day, a major decision loomed over the company, an acquisition of a smaller, struggling business that could potentially bring in massive profits. However, the deal was fraught with complications. The acquisition would mean laying off many employees from the acquired company, creating a huge dilemma for Valmore's leadership team. The discussions were tense, with some executives pushing for the deal, arguing that it would bring immense financial benefits. Others, however, were hesitant, unsure of the ethical implications of the layoffs. As the debate raged on, Eleanor quietly listened, absorbing every argument, every concern. Finally, she spoke. If we proceed with this acquisition, we need to think about the people who will lose their jobs. We can't just focus on the numbers. We have to figure out a way to help them transition, to make sure they're supported, even if we're not able to keep them all. Her voice, though soft, was clear and firm. What we do next will define who we are as a company. Do we want to be remembered for making money or for making a difference? Her words were met with silence. For a moment, the room felt suspended in time. The adults, who had been fighting over the potential profits, now had to confront the human side of the equation. The room was filled with a mix of discomfort and respect, but in that moment it was clear. Elena had once again brought the conversation back to what mattered most: people. In the days that followed, Valmore's leadership team worked tirelessly to find a solution. They set up a comprehensive transition plan for the affected employees, offering severance packages, job retraining programs, and assistance in finding new employment. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step in the right direction. Elena's impact continued to ripple through the company. Her commitment to empathy, her ability to understand both business and human needs, became the core of Valmore's new vision. The company was thriving, not just because of its financial success, but because it had learned to balance profit with purpose. Years passed, and Elena's influence only grew. By the time she was a teenager, she'd earned a seat on the board of directors, but even then, she remained humble, still focused on the things that had made her successful in the first place: listening, connecting, and leading with her heart. Her legacy at Valmore wasn't just about the deals she closed or the profits she helped generate. It was about the culture she helped create, a culture where people were valued not just for their skills, but for their humanity. Elena had proved that even the youngest among us can change the world, and that true leadership isn't defined by age or experience, but by the way we treat each other. As she stood in front of the company, delivering a speech on the future of Valmore, she looked out at the room full of executives, employees, and collaborators. She had come a long way from the little girl who had stepped into that boardroom for the first time. But as she spoke, it was clear that her journey wasn't over yet. The world had so much more to offer, and Elena was ready to embrace it. And just like that, Elena's story became a reminder to us all. Leadership isn't about titles or age. It's about the courage to be yourself, the ability to connect with others, and the wisdom to lead with empathy.